Petina Gappah, thank you for talking to the One Read podcast.
Thank you so much, Molara. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Wonderful, thank you. How does it feel? Does it feel to be a September Book of the Month author, and why did you want to be part of this?
Look, I mean, it was just the most wonderful, incredible offer from the One Read app. And of course I said yes, because imagine being read across, a continent for a whole month. And I just love the old Victorian serialization of novels, Charles Dickens and, all those guys, where people would wait at the docks. There's a famous incident where people would wait at the docks in New York to see what happens to a character that Charles Dickens had left on the brink of death in the serialization before. So I just love that idea of people waiting to find out what's going to happen in the next chapter. So of course I was thrilled and delighted to be part of this wonderful adventure.
I mean, which goes back to the origin of the novel in itself, kind of.
I call it my Victorian novel. I call it my Victorian novel. I've always wanted to write one. Believe it or not, one of my favorite childhood novels was that awful novel, King Solomon's Mines.
Yeah, I read that before I was 10, yes.
Exactly, right? So when you're at that age and you're just reading it at the level of adventure, and you want to know what's going to happen, and that horrible woman, Gagul, is she going to, I don't know, kill them all or something? And then of course you read it much later and you see the racial subtext. But I just love the idea of those Victorian adventure novels, Treasure Island, all those stories where people are going on a mission. So in a sense, that was what was the kind of thing that was running sort of behind it, that pushed me to write this thing, because I wanted to write an adventure story set in Victorian times. But then it took me in a completely different direction, which is wonderful.
Great. Congratulations on publication of Out of Darkness, Shining Light. What's it been like since it's been published?
It's sort of come in waves, because first of all, I mean, it was published in what has been a very strange year. So the version we're talking about here is the UK, and the one they call the UK and Commonwealth. That's the one that would have come to Nigeria. So that was published in February, but the month before that, my father had died. So it was actually published around my father's birthday. So there was this surreal quality to it. And at the same time, it's the first time I've had a book published in the US before being published in what is my traditional market, which is the UK and Commonwealth. So, the book had also come out a few months before in September, and my father got to read it, not only to read it, but to read it twice.
Oh.
Excuse me, and not only to read it twice, but to interrogate me. Because my father wasn't a fiction person at all. He was somebody who just loved history and biographies. And so he wanted to really find out what was true in the novel, and what did I make up, and how did I come to create this character. It was a wonderful conversation. So the book was published against all of that. And so the rest of the year, of course, as you know, the world shut down. And all the travel that had been planned for the book, Australia, New York, all over Europe and so on, just didn't happen. So it's been a strange kind of experience of having spent 20 years writing a book. And then it's published into all of this sorrow and sadness, but somehow it also manages to give a little bit of ray of joy to people. So that's really the experience of publishing the book.
I mean, what you say about what you've just said about even talking about this book with your dad prior to his passing, that's so moving. That's so moving, and I hope that that's something that you will hold on to in cherishing his memory. But also what you say about COVID-19 happening and not being able to go on a book tour. So it's particularly heartwarming from this end in Lagos that the story is has traveled all through this September throughout Africa amongst readers via the One Read app. Can you talk about what other ways you've had to adapt as a writer during this COVID-19 period?
Well, I mean, certainly the One Read app was the most fun thing I've done, just the most crazy and out there. And you were part of the negotiations, Molara. I think it was a curveball for my publishers. No one quite knew what to do with this innovative way of getting a book across. So that was a lot of fun. But I've been doing other things as well. And I'm sorry to say, I'm a Luddite. You know, the Luddites, those people who used to go around during the
Oh,
Industrial Revolution,
yes.
destroying machines. Well, I would have led the Luddites because I just hate, all aspects of technology. I mean, why do the things never behave when they're supposed to behave? So I have a desktop computer where I work from, and it's the only one that works with headphones, but at the same time, it's the slowest machine that I have. So it takes 10 minutes just to load a Zoom invitation, right? And then I have a laptop, but the minute I put in my headphones, all sound disappears. And then I have a phone, but I don't really know how to turn it in landscape and whatnot. So I've been doing a lot of these Zoom conversations and clean feed conversations and app or something like that. It's not my natural environment, especially 16, and as a computer whiz kid is not here, So it's been an adventure promoting using technology to talk to readers around the world. But it's when it works, it's been a lot of fun. I've done about 4 or 5 book clubs. I love to talk to book clubs. I've done book clubs I think there were 4 in South Africa and 1 in the UK, and I've got another one coming up in the UK, and there should be 1 in the US that I do as well. I especially like talking to book clubs because it's such an intimate space, and usually have no more than 20 people joining in, which is always a lot of fun. So you really have time for each person. So yeah, that's what I've been doing, and of course writing a few think pieces, which have led to other larger projects. For instance, I started writing an essay to accept this wonderful prize I got in the US, the Chautauqua Prize. And it was an essay about statues and decolonization and so on. And then I thought to myself, this could actually be a book. So I've started to write a book about decolonization, sort of essays on decolonization. So yeah, so all these opportunities to talk about the book have led me to reflect more deeply about some of its themes, and have actually led me to take my work in new direction.
Yeah, I think all of us, after being shell-shocked at the early stages of COVID-19, ended up seeing, of course, we regret all the illness and the deaths, but we're still in the business of living. And what's happened is people seeing opportunities, new ways of doing things. And I do suspect that even when COVID-19 is gone, some of these new skills and new ways of seeing and doing that we've been forced to adapt to, some of them will stay, do you think?
I absolutely think they will. And you know what it is? I actually, the way I look at it is that the world tried really hard to get over the thing that's at the heart of the human condition. I think is loneliness, and we tried really hard to get over loneliness using technology. When you can't touch the people you love, when you can't see the people you love. And I think we really rose to the challenge as a species to say, listen, this is how we can actually remain in touch, which was really lovely. And it's really interesting to see that same sort of desire to get above loneliness, that desire to connect, being expressed in the book world. All these writers who also had books. I mean, one of my biggest fears is that there are so many books that are just going to get lost in the void this year. So many amazing books, right? So one of my personal missions is to talk about as many of these books as possible, right? But I've just been so moved by the way in which writers have tried to connect in other ways with their readers. And I think, Molara, you're right. I think we're going to see a lot more of this use of technology, especially because, frankly, it is much cheaper. I mean, you do lose something in not having that human connection. Imagine being at Ake in the green room and drinking cola wine and I don't know what,
Yeah.
But you also gain something, I think, from being able to reach a global audience, especially if you set it up correctly, if you're reaching a global audience beyond the immediate place that you had hoped to visit. So yeah, I think there's a lot that I think we are going to keep with us, even as the world opens up again.
Definitely. Talking about some of the things you've done, some of the events you've been part of online in promoting Out of Darkness, Shining Light. Yesterday, you were on Instagram Live with the Kitchen Butterfly talking about food in relation to this novel. Can you share some of what you were trying to achieve with food in the novel?
That was such an incredible conversation. Did you listen in on it? I mean, I just it was just so much fun and just so enjoyable. And by the way, that's the really fun thing as well, that the African literary spaces that have offered me space have had a completely different take on the book to the non-African spaces, and maybe we can talk about that later. But yes, food is important to the novel. It's important in the life of one of the main characters, Halima, who's a cook. And it's important in two ways. I mean, obviously she's a cook and her mother was a cook, right? But they're also traveling in this jungle where she feels constrained. She can't really show Wana Dawoodi, David Livingstone, she can't show her master what she can do, right? And there's a very funny passage which is actually inspired by a passage I lifted directly from David Livingstone's journals, where somebody says, oh, you can't tell the difference between tea and coffee, and David Livingstone said so as well. Wana Dawoodi said so, and she immediately goes to shout at him to say, what are you talking about? Who would be able to tell the difference between tea and coffee in this jungle? I mean, everything is disordered, and I don't have my things set up in the way that I want, and I'm just cooking on 3 stone fires. I am the daughter of the Surya, of the Liwali of Zanzibar, and so on and so on. So food is important to the self-esteem of Halima as a character. And it's also just important to the plotting and the mechanics of the journey, because there's a battle scene that they end up involved in simply because they're so hungry. And so they've been marching, the companions have been marching on this long journey, and they come across this town, and the people won't let them in because the rumor has traveled that they're traveling with a dead body. And they're hungry, and they decide, you know what, we're going to take this town by force, because they have something that the townspeople don't have. They have superior Western weapons, so they use them.
Wow.
Yeah, so to make a short story of a very long answer, food becomes important not only as the thing around which one character identifies, but it also becomes an important plot device as the companions march. And by the way, I had to calculate, Molara, when
Yes.
Ramadan was in 1874, 1873, 1874, because a lot of the party, a lot of the men were Muslim men from Zanzibar and Pemba. So of course they would have observed Ramadan, right? And imagine now you're marching, right? Not only do you have this dead body that's honestly beginning to smell, right? And you're marching through these villages and towns with people who are not exactly going to embrace you warmly if you tell them, hi, can we pass through with our dead body, right? On top of that, your supplies of food are dwindling, right? You've got these mysterious deaths, people keep dropping and you don't understand why, right? And then on top of that, you're facing Ramadan and you have to march on an empty stomach, So it was a lot. So food was really important in helping me plot the action.
From what you say, food was also an act of creativity, much like what you as a writer does, what you do as a writer. Food itself
Yeah.
is creativity. Kitchen Butterfly that you were talking about yesterday has to be creative in creating all these, these dishes. And
Yes,
Halima,
absolutely.
going through unfamiliar terrain, has to adapt, has to use
Yes.
her imagination. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. There's a wonderful passage where they come across this fruit that is called breadfruit, right? And I think they mistake it for something like bread, right? Not realizing that actually it's just it's a fruit, like anything else. So by the time they come back to eating the leftovers, the thing has rotted. You know, it's rotted in the heat and so on. So they've had to adapt to unfamiliar food, and also just to not being able to cook food in the way that Halima and the women would be used to. And one of my favorite episodes, actually, I got the flash of inspiration when I was in Victoria Falls for the first time. I was in Victoria Falls for the first time about 3 years ago. Excuse me. And I saw a warthog, you know, those wild pigs.
Yes.
Right, and it was sort of like moving around the lawn of
Like the
the
one,
place.
like the cartoon one in the Lion King.
Exactly,
When
exactly.
I
Now, is
was a
that
young warthog.
when he was a young
Warthog!
warthog?
I'm enjoying
We
this
should,
too much, Petina.
we've been, we should not give up our day jobs, whatever happens. I hope we didn't shatter some poor person's ears. But remember Pumbaa. I mean, of course, I know the story backwards because my son was a child at the time that the first Lion King came out, and he loved it. But
I
remember
know the story backwards also.
I
Because
think
of
also
my
because of your
sons.
children, yeah,
Yeah.
their sons, exactly, yeah. So Pumbaa, is he a pig or what is he? So they come across a warthog and they can't quite decide. And then the Muslim men in the party somehow convince themselves that, oh, this creature is a herbivore. So, you know, it might look like it could be a pig, but it's not really a pig, because pigs eat everything. You know, pigs will eat anything. Whereas these are clean animals. They are they are herbivores, so it's okay to eat it, right? Of course, but of course you sort of think to yourself, maybe it was hunger that was driving them, and you know, to sort of flout religious principles. But yeah, so I have a lot of fun with putting them under stress in different ways around food, and not just food, but around other things as well. But food certainly plays a huge driver of a lot of the action.
Wonderful. You said you had to calculate when Ramadan was in the 1800s, that particular period, and which leads nicely to the question I was always burning to ask: what kind of research did you have to do to get this novel and give it to the world and to readers in Africa and everywhere?
Gosh, I mean, I read everything. I mean, I read the primary source. I became almost a historian, distinguishing between my primary sources and my secondary sources. So my primary sources were the journals themselves, what Livingstone, Stanley, Cameron, Speak, Burton, Grant, all those guys, what they actually wrote about expedition life. And from those accounts, I got a very good image of what expedition life was like. So that was the first thing I had to establish. What was expedition life like? So those original journals were very, very helpful. And then I also then looked at things like, you know, I spent a whole month, I think it was actually 3 months, writing in Scotland, going to the National Library of Scotland, looking at David Livingstone's letters, going to his birthplace where he was born, just to get an understanding of the kind of childhood that he had. And of course, not all of it would have made it into the book as at that level of detail, but I just needed to be confident in my mind that I knew who this person was, even though he doesn't appear that much in the book. But I really needed to get into Livingstone's psyche and to get into his style of writing, his way of seeing the world. So that was really important for me to read all those letters. And then the secondary research was really around the African presence in the expeditions, because of course they didn't, apart from Jacob Wainwright, and we can talk about that later, they didn't write journals, they didn't write themselves into history. So they were written about by their bwanas, by their masters, but I also had to sort of excavate them in a way to find them in other accounts. So I spent a lot of time reading through the Uganda Review, which was a wonderful publication I found online, where some researchers in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, had gone to East Africa to look for some of the companions and get their perspective and get their story. So that was absolutely wonderful to find. And of course, I love maps. and I collect Africa maps. It's one of my favorite things to do. So I bought a map from, I think it was around a little bit later than the time of the novel, 1890, thereabouts. So things would have shifted a little bit. This was just after the scramble, but it was very important for me to understand exactly the territory and the terrain through which the companions were traveling. So the maps were important. The food was important. I became an expert in the food of Oman, the food of Oman in Zanzibar. Because of course the great cultural thing that was happening at the time is that you had this this meeting of the Arab world, the African world, and trade was a huge part of it as well. I researched into the slave trade itself, and I actually discovered that one of the reasons that the journey took so long was that the companions could have taken a more direct route through a port called Kilwa, but that was a slave trading port. So they had to go round up into Tanzania and then across to avoid any sort of like slave traders. So yeah, so it was just a complete immersion, Molara. And I mean, I could go on and on about the Jahazi, the ships. I actually had to establish exactly the ship that would have rescued Jacob Wainwright. So I had to look at the Navy list, the British Navy list, to see which one would have been operating off the Indian coast around 1868, which is roughly when he was rescued. So things like that, and of course learning a bit of Swahili, learning a few Yawa words because some of the men are Yawa men from Malawi. So it was really just a total immersion.
Thank you. You've answered the question I had in my mind also about what kind of research into language. You've done that very well. Thank you. What was it like carrying, this kind of immersion in the research? It seems to me you were carrying David Livingstone around for a long time. What was that like?
Yes, I was carrying the body of the Moana myself. It wasn't always fun, I tell you. I was saying to the lovely kitchen butterfly yesterday that this is more than a book for me. And that's why I feel so conflicted about some of the things that have happened, right? Because it's an obsession. I mean, it really honestly became an obsession. And I wrote it over 20 years, as I think you may know. And of course, in between, I was writing other things. I wasn't just working on the same book for 20 years. But I needed to get my skill set up because I just didn't know enough about this book to write it when I first conceived it in 1998. And I started writing it on my famous floppy disk, which I carry around as the talisman. So it's really been, as you say, I've been carrying Livingstone's bones myself, and then I brought them home. And then the world changed. So it's been a very strange and dislocating experience. But I don't know what I'm actually going to do with my with all my knowledge of expedition life.
Because you're an authority on David Livingstone
I've become an amateur expert, and there's just so many things. Like I became fascinated by different characters who are sort of tangential to the story. Like, Richard Burton was just nuts. He was absolutely nuts. And his companion, Sidi Mubarak Bombay, who deserves, by the way, to have his own treatment, not just as a novel, but as a biography, because he was the most experienced explorer in Victorian times. But because he was a Black man, he didn't get that accolade. But he crossed Africa 4 times from east to west and west to east, and he traveled with Grant and Speke and Burton and Stanley and Livingstone, right? He's the only person to connect 5 of these explorers, and the only thing that Sidi Mubarak Bombay wanted was to go to England to visit the grave of his favorite Moana, who was John Hannington Speke. And of course it didn't happen because who's going to take a freed slave to England just to visit a grave, But I just saw, so I've got so many of these characters who and by the way, Ilyich Troyanov, who's this fantastic Bulgarian writer, has written a book about Richard Burton, narrated from the perspective of 3 of the people closest to him, and one of them was Sidi Mubarak Bombay. So he does exist in fiction, which is wonderful. But there's so many of these characters, like Mary Kingsley. You guys, you encountered Mary Kingsley, right? At some point, she traveled in West Africa. She was just a totally nuts, crazy woman. Imagine this, white lady in her crinolines and so on, traveling through West Africa. trying to so-called civilize the natives. I mean, what is that?
Yeah.
What propels such a character, and what must people think of such a mission? I'm more interested in returning the gaze. So there's so many of these stories, Molara, that I could spend an entire lifetime writing about, but unfortunately, I get taken by very different things. So right now, I'm into the Portuguese age of discovery. I am interested in the Portuguese explorers who first opened up Africa to the world, because we forget that there were other trade links that existed long before colonization. So I'm looking at people like Tristan da Cunha and Diego Cao and, Vasco da Gama's instruction to his people, find me Christians and spices, and how that led to this explosion of Portuguese exploration and the early encounters between Europe and Africa. I love that. I think I said in one of my answers to you that I love those moments when civilizations meet and things happen and there's great social transformation, whether it's in trade, it's in religion, languages, because things really happen that are quite interesting there.
Wonderful. You said something there that could have been the line of a poem. Who wants to take a freed slave to England to visit a grave? How poignant.
Oh, it's such a sad, for me, it's such a sad story because they were happy to use him and his services. And of course they paid him, and I hope it was a fair wage. It was hard work being a companion. And Bombay was at the skilled level of an expedition leader. So Stanley made sure that he was always the expedition leader, because the expedition leader makes or breaks an expedition. He gives morale to the marching. He organizes things. I mean, it's project management, proper, right?
Yeah.
And all this man wanted was to go to England to visit Speke's grave. But of course, no one would have thought, let's pay a passage to England for Bombay. No one would have thought of that. They just saw him as this instrumental person who was useful for a particular purpose.
Whereas white people go around the world on a whim.
On a whim.
All the time.
Perfectly entitled.
Entirely for no reason, all the time.
Yes.
With
yes.
ease of passage.
I went to India for the first time a couple of years ago, and I wrote on Twitter that I've decided to go to India to find myself. And of course, people saw the joke and saw the humor. But this idea that a whole continent exists so that you can work out your trauma and your neurosis, it's actually quite funny. Actually, that's a brilliant idea for an essay. You could actually have an essay where you just look at this trope of the white guy, sort of like Africa is the savior for white guilt or whatever. Mm-hmm. This white guy coming to Africa to work out his demons, and it's such a familiar trope, and so the whole continent exists just to be a backdrop, excuse me, a backdrop for somebody to work out their psychological bullshit.
I love that. So 20 years ago, what is it about David Livingstone that 20 years ago made you see him as a viable subject to explore in the terrain of fiction?
So it was really the companions, but to get to the companions, I have to go a little bit further than 20 years, which is, I have to go back to my childhood as one of a group of Black kids who integrated a formerly all-white school at Independence, right? And so we've come into the school with its cultures and its French motto, "Fais bien, fais tout." It's nice school uniform, and we wear hats for the first time because, of course, if you're in the township schools like we were, the sun didn't burn equally on black and white, But of course, if you're at a white school, you now need a hat, and you have different kind of food, and if you have eggs every day, people mock you and all that kind of thing. So we had to acclimatize quite quickly. And one of the things that I loved, of course, was access to books. And I joined a library, the Queen Victoria Memorial Library, and I just read everything I could in that first year. And one of the books I read was David Livingstone, Weaver Boy, which was this book about David Livingstone and what he sounded such a saintly person. He was just so wonderful and such an adventurer. And I then decided I wanted to be an explorer. And at the same time, I'd discovered Shackleton and Scott and Amundsen and the race for the Antarctic. And I just thought this was such a glorious life to be an explorer. So I wanted to be an explorer. I wanted to grow up to look for the source of the Nile and so on. And so at that early stage, it was fascination with exploration with David Livingstone. And then later, at the age of 16, when we did African history properly, we were the first year in the new curriculum who actually did African history properly. So, and here it was really all about returning the gaze, and it was about Africanizing the story of colonialization, and not just telling it from the perspective of Berlin, but from the perspective of what happened on the ground. So then now I'm learning that when Livingstone died, his faithful companions, Chuma and Susi, carried his body for 9 months and buried his heart under a tree in what is now northern Zambia. So suddenly this thing that is history becomes very real, and I can locate it in the geography of the place. I was born in Zambia. So David Livingstone's heart is buried in my homeland, you know. He came to Zimbabwe, and I've got all these maps of his journeys, you know. And so it became something very real, and especially when you then bring in the Africans, it becomes the most incredible story. So I wanted to answer the question, why did they do it? So that really was, so it started off as an obsession with exploration in Livingstone, and it became an obsession with his companions and why they did this extraordinary act of carrying a dead body for 9 months.
And also, it's a humanizing story, because most people, when you hear for the first time that they carried a white man's body for 9 months, trying to get him back to his homeland, you might think, you might sniff and be cynical and think at first that, oh, how subservient. But you humanize these people. That was clearly part of your project in writing this?
Well, humanize in the sense of showing the roundness of the people, that it wasn't just, they were not just these dumb servants who couldn't speak for themselves and all they're known for is this faithful act. I mean, they had complete lives. Some of them were not very nice people. Some of them were nice people. Some of them, you know, a mixture of good and bad. And for me, it was important to present this decision in a realistic manner. And I found about 4 or 5 different motives. But one of the things I really love is that in the Victorian popular imagination, they buried his heart under a tree in Africa. And his heart became at one with the soil of his travels. You know, that whole romantic, oh, these lovely Africans, how nice of them to take out David Livingstone's heart and bury it in the land or the country, Africa, that he loved so much. But it was actually a very practical decision, Molara, because you can't exactly dry offal, you know. You can't dry liver and intestines and hearts. I mean, it's why when we kill an animal, those are the things we first take out to cook immediately, you know, because...
And those are the things that rot first.
They're the things that rot first. So to avoid the problem of what to do with the moana's insides, they took them out, all of them, the large intestine, the small intestine, the spleen, you know, the liver, and they buried it all in a biscuit tin, in an empty biscuit tin, under a tree. So it wasn't just the heart, it was everything else. And then having done that, they kind of like opened him up, and they basically made him into, for the longest time I was calling the book Livingstone Jerky, right? So basically made him into jerky. They dried him into biltong, as we call it in Southern Africa. So they dried him first on one side and then on the other.
And also some kind of mummy, really.
Exactly, they mummified him effectively. And luckily for them, by the end of his life, he was a pretty small man, so there wasn't much to dry. So, you know, and Halima says, oh, you know, roughly, you know, it's kind of like size of a large goat. So it shouldn't take too long because he's got that kind of like goatee weight kind of thing, you know. So I had, as you can imagine, I had a lot of fun and a lot of humor with the aspects of preparing the body for burial, you know. And what is really astonishing, Molara, is that when they did open up the body, they basically did a very rough post-mortem because they noted what the body looked like. And thanks to that, we now know that Livingstone had a very large tumor, probably a cancerous tumor. And it's one of the things that could have finished him off, you know. So they took very careful note, because one of the companions was a former doctor's assistant in Bombay, in India. So it was really a joy to write those aspects. But yes, this idea of the dumb, mute natives who acted out of loyalty, it was far more complicated than that. It really was.
So it was a joy to write. Any parts that you found particularly challenging?
I had a few battles with my agent and my editor about the character of Jacob Wainwright. Especially because, especially, you know, so Jacob Wainwright is this really uptight young man, very, very much a believer in himself, one could say, but also completely blind in many ways. So I wanted him to be a foil, in a way, to Halima. Halima is a slave, or believes she's a slave, but she's the most free person in the book. She's freer even than Livingstone, because she doesn't have any obsessions, you know. But Jacob Wainwright, he was a rescued slave. You know, he was freed as a boy, but he's the most constricted, the most enslaved person in the book. So I wanted to have that contrast. And the way that Jacob is enslaved was troubling to my wonderful editorial team, because one of the ways in which he kind of like manifests his knowledge and, you know, how superior he is to quote the Bible, right? And he knows his Bible really well, as do I, right? And my editors were like, oh, there's just so much of the Bible. And I said, you haven't been to Africa. This is actually too little Bible as far as Jacob Wainwright is concerned. So we had that battle of how to not have too much reference to a book of faith that a lot of people in the West just don't relate to at that level, especially, you know, liberal people who read literary fiction and so on. But at the same time, you know, I was so influenced by Hilary Mantel, and she kept saying, when you write historical fiction, don't take your characters out of their situation. You know, you can't give them modern ideas that they would not ever have had. You know, so I always say that Jacob Wainwright, Halima, everybody can invite a feminist reading, for instance, but there's just no way Halima is a feminist. And there's just no way that Jacob Wainwright would have been aware that he was a self-loathing black man. He just wouldn't have been aware of it.
I mean, the level of
that
there would have been no discourse really to even
exactly
lead to that kind of enlightenment.
Exactly. So he is his world, you know, so he is the world that was given to him. He is that world of a little frightened boy, you know, kidnapped from his lovely mother and sister and Jamile, and, you know, in his village in Malawi, taken, you know, to the coast by Yawa slave traders, then sold on to Arabs, sent up the coast, possibly to Zanzibar to be sold at the market, and then rescued on the Indian Ocean by British gunboats and taken to be educated in India, right? And there he was given Jesus. The blood of Jesus saved him. So of course he's going to consider salvation to be rooted in Christ. Of course he's going to have that burning mission to come back to Africa to save his people. And of course he's going to look at himself as being made by the white people who rescued him. So that's such a beautiful way of saying it, and I think I'm going to borrow that answer next time I talk about this, which is to say that that discourse just wasn't possible to lead to that moment of awakening or enlightenment or self-knowledge.
Indeed. We could talk to you forever, Petina. Thank you so much. What, for readers who haven't read Out of Darkness, Shining Light yet, what would you say to them to urge them to pick up this book now?
Oh, what would I say to readers to make them read it now? Well, I will say that I wrote the kind of book that I want to read. It's propulsive, it's immersive, and you won't be able to stop until you get to the last page.
And having read a good deal of your writings, I agree with that wholeheartedly. Thank you so much for talking to One Read.
Thank you so much, Molara. And thank you so much to One Read and to your fantastic sponsors, Sterling Bank, and to everybody who has made this app what it is. And I hope it continues to grow and grow.
Thank you.